This is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to episode number 13. So Kaushik, what are we going to talk about today? I'm not really sure, but I did hear a little bit about that it may have something to do with another highly requested topic that we've talked about in the past. What might that be?
What's another topic that we love talking about? Let's see. What was the first episode that we actually did on Fragmented?
I think it was cat videos.
Cat videos?
Yeah.
Perfect. Cat videos it is then. No, so we haven't talked about testing in a while. The very first episode that we did was on testing. So we thought it might make sense to actually go in detail and talk about testing, but maybe take a little different take on testing. And we have a very special guest with us today. Someone who's also considered a pro at testing. And we're going to ask her to enlighten us with more thoughts. Welcome to the show, Cola Bug.
Before we get into the meat of all of our testing stuff, Corey, can you do a little bit for us and for the listeners and, kind of explain a little bit about yourself, maybe where you work and how you got started with Android development, just so the listeners can get familiar?
Sure, I'd love to. So I studied computer science and worked my way through college. After that, I started working with a few different companies, everywhere from corporates to consultings and startups, with a lot of different technologies, centered on Android in 2010, and I've been there ever since. So I started at Comcast, where we were building the Xfinity TV application, and I've done about 14 apps after that. So last year, ran my own business for a while. I trained Android on site, also wrote 2 books that we'll talk about a little bit later. And also I've been doing conference speaking in the Android space since 2012. I've done some international conferences. I've done some local conferences on 4 continents, which is really cool. Actually 3 where I talked I've visited for. And then this year I was selected as one of the Google Developer Experts. So that was pretty new. My profile's not even up yet, but soon, hopefully. And then
wow.
Outside of that, I also run the Google Developer Group here in Philadelphia. So I founded that soon after I started with Android in 2011.
Congrats
I do
on
a lot of
GDE.
things. Oh, thanks. You too, Don.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Hey guys, I think I'm feeling a little left out here. I mean, like
You live in San Francisco, Bay Area. You can't feel left out. She lives in Philadelphia. I'm going to be living in New Jersey soon, so you're in the middle of the tech hub.
Yeah, we'll be neighbors.
Yeah, exactly. I'll be pretty close to Philly.
Cool. You should come down to our meetup then.
I do plan to, actually. That is on the docket.
So that's actually a question I had. So I have heard the terms GDE, GDG being thrown around. And I know GDEs, I know a couple of GDEs, like I mentioned in the last episode that we have. And these are like some of the best developers that I've met in the Google and Android world. What exactly is a GDE and what exactly is a GDG for the few of us who don't have any clue and are usually very bad with acronyms?
Cool. I guess I could tackle that one. So Google Developer Group, or a GDG, is really just a meetup centered around Google technologies. So the GDGs are kind of all over the map. Philadelphia started out as an Android-only group, but now we have Angular, Go, Glass, Android, and I feel like there's another one. And then when there's stuff that cross-cuts, like there was a Dart flight school that we did in with the JavaScript group. So we ran that as part of the GDG as well. So it covers a lot of different technologies. Usually they're meetups where you go and listen to somebody talk for a while, but sometimes there are events like getting people to start developing Android stuff. They have Garage, which is like a weekly meetup thing. They have, they do like study sessions and work through Android, the Udacity courses, for example. So it's really a great resource if you're looking to get into technology or if you're already there and you want to learn more and interact with other people in your area.
Interesting. And are these groups like sort of sponsored by Google or something? Or, I mean, do they have Google's blessing or are they like sort of like directed or how does it work?
So it's kind of a blended model. Some get funding outside of Google. You get some benefits from Google, but usually that's just kind of covering our meetup expenses and a small stipend sometimes for certain events. But usually it's kind of self-sponsored.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
That's the way that the Phoenix one has been. I haven't taken any stipend at this point for the regular meetups. I know for the Dev Fest and so forth, they will provide some level of support. At least here in Phoenix is what they've done. So, but it's been kind of mainly grassroots out here, but with a little bit of Google's blessing.
Very cool. And what about the GDEs? What are GDEs?
So I'm pretty new, so I'm still figuring out what that means. But basically it means Google Developer Expert. And what it takes to become an expert is community involvement and technical ability. So it's not just, are you the best Android dev out there? Are you also helping other people get on board with Android? So like I run a meetup and do conferences and things like that. So I think it's part presence and part technical ability.
Excellent. So it's basically like the most selfless Android developer citizens you have out there. They get awarded the GDEs.
Possibly. Hopefully it's like that. I don't know.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think it's fair. Both of you have done some amazing stuff and rightfully deserved.
Well, thank you, Kaushik.
Thank you.
So, Corey, I met you at I.O. and I had a blast just like talking with you. And I noticed some things also that are super cool that I've always wanted to ask you.
Okay.
So the first thing is, I know you like traveling a lot.
Yes, I do. So like I mentioned earlier, I've been on 4 continents. Kind of started with I finally had money, so I started traveling. So for our honeymoon, we went for a whole month in Europe, and that was fun because we went everywhere. It was kind of crazy because it was like every 4 days we were somewhere else, but it was also great. And I developed a love for trains there for sure.
Interesting.
And then after that, I started conference speaking. So through that, I've spoken in Tunis, Tunisia, at a DroidCon there.
Wow.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. That was in 2012. Now it would be a little scary, sadly. Hopefully some of the troubles in the area calm down a bit. But then I spoke at London as well, and Sweden and Amsterdam on Android stuff. And then sadly, my father died in 2012, like right after DroidCon London. Came home and I was like, oh, I need to take some time, think. I'm not super happy where I am right now. So I took a sabbatical, and there I went to South America for 6 weeks by myself to study Spanish and to travel around and just kind of think and figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Still trying to figure that out, but it was really great because I was there all alone. I've never traveled alone, and then I went to another continent for 6 weeks with a different language.
Whoa.
So I started in Lima, and I went over to Cusco and did some language study there. I went to Machu Picchu and stuff. Also went to Arequipa, which is also in Peru, briefly Santiago, and then Mendoza and Buenos Aires in Argentina. Yeah, and then let's see what else.
Wow, you've been all over. It's amazing.
Yeah, that is some list there.
Yeah, and I kind of want to live in a
fantastic.
Spanish-speaking country in general, just to practice it all day and become actually fluent. Like, I can speak fairly well now, but I want to become really fluent.
I've done a lot of traveling as well, and like when you mentioned trains, it reminded me of my beautiful travels in Caltrain every single day.
Yeah, commuting doesn't really count. I'm commuting right now, too.
It is a long commute.
And this is the Alma Street station, and look at the gorgeous surroundings. That's funny.
So one thing I know also is you've been a prolific... No, it's not sketcher. It's a sketch artist, a Sketchnote artist. Is that the right term?
I don't know that I'd call myself an artist. I'm still pretty new at the whole Sketchnote thing. I started in, like, March.
So saying you were sketchy wouldn't be a good idea?
Sketchy would... I'm pretty sure sketchy is not the correct...
Yeah, that's not
now
the
they're
correct term.
done, but yeah. Sketcher is the brand, though, the shoe brand, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are Sketchnotes? I mean, I saw this earlier when you sent them to us, and then I looked at them like, oh, that's cool. And then I've kind of seen them other places, but can you kind of describe what they really are for the people who may not know what they are?
Sure, totally. There's basically you use images and fonts and words in your notes and to make them much more interesting. There's a great book that got me started called The Sketchnote Handbook. Also, the reason why I started is I saw Chuki at one of the conferences we were both at. Chuki Chan, she was doing Sketchnotes, and I was like, whoa, that looks like fun. So we both kind of started the same day. But basically, you use colors, you use words, you use fonts, and you just make it interesting. So I've been doing it a lot since that day. I don't think there's been a day that's gone by, probably, that I haven't done some form of sketchnoting. So I'm doing everything from, like, small how-to tutorials to sketch blogs. Even preparing for this podcast, I ended up sketchnoting all the things I kind of wanted to go over here. And all my work notes every day are sketchnotes. So if you looked at it, it kind of looks like, I don't know, almost a comic book.
No, I mean, it's amazing. And the even more amazing thing is like when we were at I/O, I think it was What's New in Android. That was the session. And typically these sessions, like especially the What's New in Android session, goes like at a crazy fast pace. So Corey was sitting just next to me, and I saw her like sketchnoting, and I was like, "Holy cow, this looks like even more interesting." So I saw her actually like cover the whole session like through Sketchnotes. It was mind blowing.
Yeah, a lot of people think it'll be distracting, but for some reason it really focuses you to not only do the analytical side of your brain, but you're also pulling in the drawing and creative side, and getting what you're hearing.
So before we move on to like our primary topic for the day, are there other things that interest you, Corey? Things that you find inspiring that you'd like to like share?
Sure. I'm kind of all over the map for interest. I love everything from art to technology to outdoorsiness and stuff. One thing that I've been doing kind of on the side is trying to bridge the digital divide and everything. So I really care about broadening participation, not only here in the U.S., but internationally as well. So one of the things I forgot to mention in my travels is last year I was on the board of a thing called Kids on Computers, and that's where we open up computer labs in developing nations. In this case, I went to Mexico for 3 weeks and helped them set up their labs there. So that's been really rewarding, and I want to continue to do that sort of work.
Oh, fantastic.
It'd be nice to be able to make it full-time. I just haven't really seen the right opportunity yet.
And we'll add links to the show notes to all of these organizations and the different information that we get from Corey. All right. So moving on to testing. I've been seeing recently many Android developers like sort of like bring up testing. Testing seems to be like, it's like going to the gym. Everyone feels that, yeah, I should be testing. I should be, going to the gym every day. But get real with me here. Is testing just a pipe dream? I mean, like, I want to sort of like answer some of these questions because we have got it from listeners. I have seen these questions floating around in Twitter and Reddit. Do people actually write tests in production apps? I mean, like, do they really get the benefits from testing? Let's maybe like go around and sort of like see what responses are. Don, what about you? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I don't think testing is a pipe dream. I think it's a reality. Unfortunately, there's just a lot of ceremony that's involved to get some of the testing set up, and a lot of people just don't know how to do it properly. To be 100% honest, my code coverage is currently abysmal in a current project, but there's a lot of other factors, and some might call them excuses, to why that is. When you're in a small startup, you have speed to market, et cetera, and there's a whole bunch of other things that we could get into that literally could be a whole other show in itself. But I do think it's important to test, and learning how to test properly is hugely beneficial. But at this time, no, I don't have a ton of tests in my application. Just got minimal tests, unfortunately.
What about you, Corey? What are your thoughts on testing?
I'm actually pretty into testing. I do have a lot of apps out there that have testing, as well as I've trained people in teams to do that. Capital One, when we got here, they did have testing, but it was all instrumentation, and it wasn't the best coverage, but there was definitely decent coverage there. We've expanded that now to add Robolectric testing as well. But yeah, there's always pressures, and I hear a lot of people, and I'm not going to call it an excuse, Don, but it's like, oh, it's too hard. Maybe I shouldn't do this, which is fine if it's like something that isn't high value to test it. Maybe write a defect in whatever bug tracking thing you're doing as technical debt and come back to it later. But especially high important code paths, you need to make sure that things work as they expected. And then part of the problem in Android is it's just hard, and it shouldn't be as hard as it is. There's a ton of different tools across all different types of testing. So you can do automated testing, you can do instrumentation testing, you can do UI testing. So it's really confusing to someone who's trying to come into that space. And then the reason why I do it, basically I can't write code without tests most of the time. It's just a lot faster, and we can go into what that process looks like a little bit later. But like, it's just I've gone back to code bases where I have to build, wait, press a button, okay, cool, then go change my code, do the same thing over and over again, and that cycle is just really, really slow.
Wow, that's a very different take. That's interesting.
That's a good take. I like it. Kaushik, what about you?
So I definitely write tests, but as I've sort of like been writing tests lately, I use this approach now where I don't necessarily think that I need like 100% coverage throughout my project. As and when I feel things might possibly break. So whenever I fear like something's going to break, or I fear that there's some logic that's tricky or complicated that when another developer comes in and won't understand what's happening and maybe break it, whenever I sense some sort of flakiness around my code base at any point, I write tests for those. So if it's something that's critical or it's something that I feel would break easily, I write tests for those. I haven't gotten to the point of like using 100% coverage, and I still do think there are huge benefits to having 100% coverage in your code base, and I guess we'll try to touch upon that a little later.
Definitely. Now, I hear a lot of people say, and I think, Corey, you mentioned this, that testing takes more time. I guess the big question is there a real value in the testing that you're getting, or is it just a bunch of code that's sitting there and just exercising stuff? What's the real benefit that you see people get out of testing?
The benefit for me is, like I mentioned earlier, it's just part of my process. So like I use Robolectric and I use a lot of code generation through, it used to be IntelliJ, now it's Android Studio, to generate a lot of the code for me. So I'm way, way faster. I think a lot of people coming to it new, yes, it's a little bit harder up front, but once you learn how to do it, it just becomes a part of your process. And I'm one of those people that I don't tell anyone that I'm testing. I just do it. You can't really dictate my process. You're just going to get it. If you hire me, you're going to get tests as part of the package.
That's fantastic. I've actually heard many people mention like the points that you mentioned. One is, of course, for most people who complain that, okay, testing takes time, it's just like any other form of art, right? If you want to get good at something, you have to keep doing it often. I hear many developers like try tests for like a day or two, and then they're like, oh my God, this takes so much time. There's no way I can get any code written. There's no way I can ship my application without sort of like avoiding these tests. And I think that's a fundamental problem. You have to sort of like understand the benefit and just like stick to it. A good friend and colleague of mine once told me, I don't think it's fair to have an opinion in testing if you've never actually done tests. So for the people who think that testing is not good, or they sort of like bring up these arguments where testing isn't worth it for your Android application, unless you've actually done testing, unless you've actually built an application with thorough tests with a lot of coverage, you don't really get to comment on testing. And this isn't meant to be said in a mean way or anything. It's just that there are certain nuances, there are certain benefits that you get from testing that you really won't absorb unless you've actually been through the whole process. If you go right from beginning to end and actually implement tests, there are certain benefits that you get that just are like invaluable. And that's pretty much why everyone says testing is a great thing.
Yeah, I mean, I love to refactor lots all the time. And it's just scary refactoring without it. I think one of the problems is there's not really a lot of good resources out there to help people get started. And like I mentioned, it's just all over the map. So they don't know, should I be using like UI Automator? Should I use Robolectric? Should I use the built-in instrumentation testing? Should I use the new unit testing in Android Studio? What should I do?
Now, you mentioned something about Robolectric, and I had said earlier that my testing was abysmal, but that's in the current project that I have. I've written thousands upon thousands of tests in Android, but when I got started early on, I tried to do everything in JUnit, and that kind of fell apart pretty quickly. And then I found Robolectric in the early days. I think it was version 0. Whatever, really early, and used it a lot. But what I ended up finding was that I kept running into these areas that were not implemented, and I had to implement my own shadows, and I wasn't sure how to do that. And eventually I dug way down to this rabbit hole where I had to go find the original developer of Robolectric, and Mike Burton and I basically had to sit down and have a big conference with him to figure out how this works so we can get some stuff under test. Do you still run into very similar things in Robolectric where the shadows aren't implemented and so forth?
I mean, there's definitely still some rough patches, but in general, it is not like it used to be. When I started with it, I think that was like 2012 maybe. Mm-hmm. Back then, there was still a lot of, okay, well, this isn't implemented yet. And then I actually have like 2 open source contributions from that because like, I really want this to be there. So then you go build it. But I think a lot of that has been built out. There are bugs, though, that pop up that you don't understand, and it's really hard to fix it. And then last year and the year before, like right after Android Studio came out, There was interest in people using Android Studio, but it was impossible to get the red-green refactor stuff at the bottom to show up in the IDE itself. You could only run it through Gradle, and that's what kept me off of Android Studio for like a year. And then last December when I was writing the book, I went through and figured out how to get Robolectric to work well with Android Studio and actually show the tests. But that was, I don't know, a week of exploration. I talked to 2 different developers on it, used a bunch of different blogs, synthesized it. One thing I did, which I have now made part of my process, was I kept like a markdown doc when I was walking through it of all the different things that I ran into. I was like, okay, I got this error, so I tried this, and then I would link in all the different web pages and stuff. So I ended up with this huge list of all the things I went through to finally make this thing work. And then I went back through and then turned it into like, okay, here's the straightforward steps to get this thing integrated. And it should not be that hard.
Yeah, that's what I found to be a big blocker getting started with a lot of Android tests. And I still have it at the GDG that I run out in Phoenix. People say, hey, like I just don't know how to get going with it. And I'll point them in the right direction, and then they'll run into that weird scenario where you're spending a day or 2 or a week trying to fix something just to get a test to pass, and then eventually they just throw their hands in there and they're like, screw it, I got to get this shipped, and then they move on. So hopefully this podcast will help them out a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a point at which it's not worth it to try and figure out how to test it, or if something is brand new to you, maybe you're not going to do a bunch of testing around that either. You need to explore first.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's what I found in a lot of startups that I've worked for is when you're basically racing to get this stuff out the door, you have to evaluate whether or not does this have enough value right now, or can we just test this manually to get it out the door and then come back and, like you said, add a defect for it and fix it a little bit later and get some tests around it.
That's a great point. Unfortunately, I've also found sometimes in startups specifically, when you're in this race to sort of like push stuff out of the door, if you postpone things, you invariably are not going to get back to actually writing the tests.
That's the truth.
Not until there's a huge blocker bug that's ruined everything, and then maybe you'll do it.
Yep. Exactly. That's the thing. Like, unfortunately, the tragedy is like the value of tests are seen the most when you don't have them. So like when things break down and you have no idea what change sort of like broke stuff, like that's when like if you really had tests, like things would have been way better.
Yeah, in those cases is when I start adding tests too, if it makes sense. A lot of the bugs that pop up, like why not have a test around it so it won't show up again?
Exactly.
So another common question that's, again, I don't want to feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, but there, like these are certain sort of common questions that keep coming up that I see here and there. One common statement that's made with regards to testing is, well, I mean, my clients only pay me to write the code. They don't pay me to write the tests. So what should I do? I mean, I can't, if someone comes and asks me to build functionality, I can't charge them for both. Or if I do, then they're not going to want me to write the tests. You made a point earlier, Corey, which I think is fantastic. And I think like we should like sort of like draw at that point more. But in general, what are your thoughts on this statement?
Basically, my own process for writing software is non-negotiable. I don't tell them. I just, make sure that my estimates include enough time. Because people think only about the short-term gains of writing the test. Like, okay, well, if I write more code right now, that's more time. But if you're going to have to maintain it over the long haul, then it really saves you time if you put that time up front, because you're going to spend a lot of time debugging later.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
I think a lot of people, though, especially in the consulting realm, they're not going to maintain it long term, so they just kind of ship it and hand it off, and then people kind of have to deal with the non-tested stuff later.
And that's an interesting perspective too, because I've been a consultant for the last 8 plus, I don't know, many years now. And I like to leave my clients with the best set of code and tests possible. And unfortunately, we do get into the situation where I can't write tests for whatever reasons. We're shipping tomorrow. There's a deadline, investors, whatever, you name it. Kaushik and I can probably tell you about it. But at the same time, I can tell you when I do walk into a client and they have tests in place, the amount of relief that I have is just tremendous. It feels so good and to walk in and see that a team has been taking care of their code base, that I'm just elated to actually go work there and just very surprised and happy to see how they've been doing things.
Yeah, and in the employment space too, like it's the same thing. Just don't tell your boss you're doing it. Just do it. A lot of times you can also get a lot of your coworkers to get interested in. They're like, oh, what are you doing there? And if you show them, you sit down with them, maybe pair program a little bit and teach them how to do it, then they're not as afraid, and then they'll might help you just keep expanding that testing code base.
And that's actually an interesting statement, because we talked about Martin Fowler in our last episode. There's actually a talk that Martin Fowler gave in which he says the exact same thing that mentioned.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I just found that from my experience, because there's definitely people who are resistant to it, but if you show them how to do it. Also, like I mentioned, there's not great documentation out there. So if you actually show them, they become comfortable and they're totally cool with it.
This is the same thing happens, I mean, not just in regards to testing, but anything in regards to like continuous integration. That same thing happens when you join teams. If they don't have it, they're like, we don't need it, we just build on this machine. Or, hey, collective code ownership. Like, no, we have this architect who does everything and we just listen to him. And so it all usually kind of boils down to tests. Do you have a good build? Can you ship from a build machine? Does everyone feel comfortable making a change in a part of a system they're not super familiar with? It all boils down to tests. They are big islands of confidence at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
So in regards to testing, Corey, if I were a new Android developer and I'm listening to this podcast and I'm kind of getting pumped up about Android testing, where would be a good place for me to start learning about testing, since I've kind of heard about this thing called Espresso, UI Automator, Robolectric, all these other frameworks? What would be a good place to get started if you had to recommend something?
Well, I'm a little biased because I wrote a book specifically on how to write how to write tests from the beginning. So one of the books I wrote was called the Android Activity Book, and you write a calculator using Robolectric from the very beginning. So it shows you how to walk through all those different steps. There is a free version of it on Gitbook. It's outdated. It's more Maven and IntelliJ centric. This book is Android Studio and Gradle centric. But yeah, so that's one place you could get started with Robolectric. I mean, they have documentation, but they don't really walk you through how to use it and what the best use cases are and things like that. But there is some documentation out there. You're going to spend a lot of time Googling. I would like to tell you that there's some beautiful resources that you can visit and go there. Now, Google now has some new training stuff. I haven't looked into Espresso deeply yet, but I think that there's probably some good resources out there for that. And then I went to a talk at Google I/O about the new unit testing that's integrated into Android Studio. I haven't played with it yet, but that's another place, hopefully, that they'll be expanding the documentation and making it clear. The sad thing is it's just the way Android is written and the way the tools work. You kind of have to take the theory of testing and figure out how to apply it to Android, and I think that's what makes it a little bit harder as well.
Square peg, round hole. So now, you had talked a little bit earlier about that you just kind of write tests by default, and which I think is awesome. I'd like to learn a little bit more about how you do that. Like, what's your testing cycle? Or if we're sitting down next to each other, pair programming, and we're going to write this feature, what does that kind of look like? How do we go about that if me and you were sitting together pair programming?
Sure. So let's say we're writing a calculator. First, I would do like an activity test and say it should not be null. And okay, great, it's not null. I instantiated the activity, started up with Robolectric stuff. Great. Then I'd be like, okay, should have one button. Go make sure that the one button exists. Should have two button all the way through all the different buttons. After that, then I would start doing things like when I click the one button, it should do this thing. When I click the two button, it should do that thing. So it really depends what your use case is, obviously, but I kind of walk through the smallest, dumbest thing that you could do next. And my unit tests are really like usually 2 or 3 lines. I try to limit setup required for it, and I try to break out all the concerns into different files. Usually my activity ones, I went through a bunch of stuff in an activity. That was a lie. What I usually do is activity, and that activity should have a fragment, and then that's kind of my activity test. I'm done with that. But then when I'm in my fragment, then I say I've got all the buttons, and then after that, they do their things or whatever. But let's say there's a bus in there, like auto or something, then I've got like a bus helper that would capture the bus events I'm throwing around and make sure that the right ones are being posted at the right times. Like if you had a display, then I would say should have a display, should have this default hint text, should show this when this type of event comes in, that sort of thing. But it's usually like really small, broken down pieces.
For your tests, do you follow the arrange, act, assert type of pattern for setting up, arranging, and asserting things, or do you follow a different pattern?
I guess I do, because I write a thing, and then I set it up, and then, Yeah, I guess so. I've just never heard that particular phrase applied to it, but sounds like what I do.
Yeah.
Red green refactor is also what I do. So I write the test, it fails. Maybe I have to generate some code based on that failing test. Once it's no longer build failing, then it might not still be right because I didn't write the code to support it. So then I'll go write that. And then green happens, which means my test is passing. And then I refactor and change tons of stuff often.
Great. For the listeners that don't know what arrange, act, assert means, it's sometimes called the AAA syntax in testing. It basically means if you have a test method inside of your test blocks or whatever, the top part of the method is where you're setting up everything for test. Maybe you're using Mockito, maybe you're using Robolectric, whatever, and you're setting up basically setting that test up, and then usually after that, you'll have a couple lines of empty space, and then you'll do the act of whatever you should want to do to create the test, and then maybe it's like clicking a button. That's you just perform the button click, and then there's another couple of empty spaces, and then it has like here's where all the assertions happen. Like I want to make sure the button turned red, and I want to make sure that the text changed to this, and XYZ happened. And it's just a way of arranging the code inside of a test, just so you think it's like I'm arranging everything, I'm acting, perform the action, and now I'm asserting what I expected to happen happens. Now, in regards to testing too, you said you use a lot of code generation. Can you tell us a little bit about that code generation? I use a little bit, but I'd like to hear exactly what you do.
My best friend in Android Studio basically is option return. So I'll write it's kind of weird because sometimes you have to create both classes at the same time depending on what you're building. But let's say we already have a base fragment there. I'll say should have the one button, and it should reference r.layout.whatever ID. Sometimes it'll generate it nicely for you. Sometimes it won't. In this case, it wouldn't because I don't have like the whole view set up and all that stuff. So let's say I do have a view though. It's kind of hard to visualize this without code in front of me. But basically, I write broken code on purpose. So I'll say create a new getter or something on a class that doesn't exist yet, and then I'll hit Option Enter, and then it'll add it for me. Or a lot of times I'll be able to add new layouts because I'll do just r.layout. whatever name, and that's that content view, and then hit Option Enter, and then it'll create my file. So I'm doing a lot of that, but then I have a lot of productivity shortcuts I use too for refactoring. So I'll do Command Option M to create a method, V to create a variable, C to create a constant, F to create a field. So there's a lot of small things like that I use.
Okay. And would those be live templates? Is that what those are inside of Android Studio, if I'm correct?
Sometimes I use the live templates as well. That's more like if you do Command N, you can say create a new thing. But this is more like I wrote broken code specifically to have it generate that code for me. I learned that trick from Uncle Bob Martin. He did a in-person training at Comcast way back in the day.
Cool.
Oh, interesting.
So I do something very similar. I mean, I use that broken code trick as well. I think it's one of the most useful features inside of the IntelliJ products. One of the things that I do is it's not live templates because you're right, that is like maybe it is, I don't know. It's a templating feature inside of Android Studio, and I forget what it's called off the top of my head, but it basically allows you to create a shortcut key or a series of, let's just say, like for example, I'm going to type ATH, and then I'll hit Tab. What it will do is auto-complete that for me into something else, and I have it turning into like assert that. And then it automatically takes my cursor to the middle of the method where I'm asserting something, and then I hit Tab again. It takes me to a .is, and this is like using some type of syntax like jassert or whatever, and it takes me to the result where I type in the result, and I hit Tab again, then it takes me to the end after the semicolon, so I can hit Enter. So I basically only have to type a couple of keystrokes to get the stuff that I'm looking for. Do you do anything like that at all?
Not yet, but I will now.
Cool, awesome.
Yeah, I use something very similar. So in the, of course, now it must be said, Google is doing a much better job specifically with making testing easier with Android, and you have like the new JUnit 4 testing added in. But in the old days when I had to switch between using JUnit 4 and JUnit 3, I do something very similar. So I had like the shortcut T3 and T4. So like T3 standing for JUnit 3 and T for JUnit 4. So I would type T3 and hit Tab, and boom, I would generate like a whole test altogether in the format of like a JUnit 3 test, because in JUnit 3, and I think we mentioned this in a previous podcast, but JUnit 3 you need to have your tests start with like the word test, right? Only then is it considered to be a test. Of course, with JUnit 4, it's like an annotation that you add, the test annotation. So I basically just type T3, T4, and then boom, I have the whole thing like generated as code. So it just makes it a little more easier to sort of like quickly add in more tests into your application.
Definitely. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit here. Earlier, we spoke a little bit about the word code coverage. A lot of people that aren't into testing have no idea what code coverage is. Corey, could you do us favors and kind of give us the quick definition and rundown of what code coverage is, maybe why devs should be worried about it, and are there any tools built into Android Studio for it, or do we have to use something else?
This is somewhere that I definitely need more training on myself, but basically, from a high level, it's figuring out which code paths are actually being executed by the tests that you've run. So I know that we looked at integrating Jacoco, and I think that is integrated in Android Studio, but it ended up being a pain, so we dropped it for now because we're trying to ship things. But yeah, so I know that there's a lot of tools out there, but back in my Ruby days, we would use tools there too to figure out, okay, are you testing this thing or not?
Definitely. Now, Kaushik, what about you? Do you use any code coverage tools or anything like that, or how do you determine your code coverage, or do you at all?
I don't actually use a code coverage tool per se. So, I mean, and by code coverage tools, you mean the ones that actually say, oh, you have like 80% of your tests, 80% of your system is covered by tests, or 90%, and they have those pretty tags on GitHub that basically show you, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So I don't use any of those, at least on the end. I know, I think on our backend system, we do have that implemented. We don't have it for the Android application, at least. So I mentioned before that code coverage is useful. I ran into like an interesting example quite recently where I thought like having good code coverage would have made life easier for me. So we were making the shift towards using app compat. And so as some of you would know, in order to like move to the whole app compat system and sort of like moving to the material design world, you change your base activity, right? And like the whole toolbar system changes a little. Like action bar, the support action bar is no longer used in the same way. You instead use the toolbar, which is way more powerful and much better to use. So the interesting thing is we have a base activity. So like I just changed the base activity and I hoped everything would work. Many places it did work, but some places it didn't. And I found this to be interesting because the places where I had my Espresso UI tests, and it's kind of weird because these errors don't necessarily get caught at code compilation time. They get caught when you actually run the application. So the places like I inherited sort of like an old code base. So like 80% of like the code base is done in a particular fashion, and 20% of the code base, which hasn't changed, still use some old system. And in that 20%, because I didn't have coverage, the only way I could actually like say for certain that things were working or not were running those features manually, testing those features manually. And that was terrible because in the end I did find two places where the application just like outright crashed because of like there were certain quirks with how you use the support action bar versus like the toolbar. Which is not to say like in the rest of the 80% of my code base, I didn't have any problems. But the advantage was in the 80% where I had at least like my Espresso tests running and like spinning up the activity and like doing some basic things. In those, just like in an automated fashion, I was immediately able to find out where things were going wrong. So like in a list of like 20 or 30 activities with like another 50 fragments, I knew exactly the places where things were going wrong because like with Espresso, when I actually ran the Espresso test, it would fail. So this is sort of like, this is like where I felt like, oh wow, if I had like a proper test coverage like throughout the system, I wouldn't have to feel so worried because in the 20% that didn't have Espresso tests, we were flying blind. I mean, I had no clue if things would work or not unless I made sure every single execution of the code path was being covered, right? So that's where like having good coverage, just like even if it's a simple test, you never know when these tests can like come out to be extremely useful. And especially like we wanted to move our whole system to material design in like the span of a week or two. If you're running at that, so this is like a perfect example where having tests would eventually sort of like reap the benefits of like moving extremely fast in your code base. And it points to what Corey was saying with refactoring, right? If I want to refactor with confidence, if I have tests, I can just like go ahead and say for certain that things would work without having to like sort of manually run through the process of testing.
Now, that's insanely good, useful information, and I completely agree with what you just said in regards to catching that code. That's the confidence I'm talking about when I walk into different clients and they have that code base and they say, hey, Don, we want to move this stuff over to Material Designer, or hey, we want to change all of our HTTP stack from this old Apache HTTP client over to Retrofit or whatever. Then I feel a lot more confident that, hey, we're not breaking the entire system. So that's huge. Now, going back to the code coverage thing that I had originally talked about, for those that are interested, there is actually a way in Android Studio to get code coverage already built into Android Studio. Now, the thing is, it's not part of the Android tests run configuration. And the way that you would do this is you just go into the run configurations. You're going to create a new run configuration. You have to create a JUnit run configuration, though. And inside the JUnit run configuration, there is a code coverage tab. And inside of there, you can choose your code coverage runner. You can either use the IntelliJ IDEA code coverage runner or the Jacoco code coverage runner. And then you can provide some various different options and so forth from there, test different classes and everything. And you'll get all that detail right there in Android Studio. Again, it's not the full Android test stuff before, but if you are doing a lot of JUnit tests, you can get code coverage for those as well.
Cool. Does that also do the Robolectric? Because it sounds like it would if you run a JUnit run config, which you need to do anyway.
I think it would. I haven't tried it. It would be worth giving it a shot, though.
Interesting. But if you didn't have tests, your code coverage would basically say 0%. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Did we formally define that? What that is for the listeners? I think
we can do it again.
Yeah.
It doesn't hurt to do it again.
Okay. So just to not to beat this to death here, but code coverage, again, for those of you, if you still don't have your head around it, it basically means that there is a code path. Maybe you have a method and it has 2 if statements in it because the if statement is based upon one of the parameters in the method. It's a Boolean value, true or false. Do you have a test that exercises both parts of that if statement? Maybe you've written a test. You say, yeah, I wrote a test. It covers that method, but you've only covered maybe that happy path where you passed in the true value, but you didn't have any test that run through the other section, the other else, which maybe is the false part of the if statement. The code coverage tools will help you identify that and say, hey, looks like here's all the code coverage in this file. You missed this portion right here. And then what it will do is it'll aggregate all of the code coverage tools will aggregate all of the test results in the coverage and say, hey, based upon all the lines in your code that you've told us to inspect, you now have 35% code coverage, meaning that 35% of the code that you're wanting us to look at has tests wrapped around it.
Makes sense. All right. So one other aspect that I wanted to touch upon is like testing versus just automated testing, right? So, and I've actually heard from big companies, and these are apps that you probably use day in and day out, that sometimes they do have testing, but the way they do it is with manual testing. They don't do automated testing. And all of the things that we're so far, everything that we've covered is basically automated testing, right? And I think this is also one reason why even certain big organizations before didn't worry too much about making sure that they have automated tests. This is, of course, gradually changing, and you can see by the way Google has put emphasis on testing this past year. But I've actually heard from really big teams where their form of testing is essentially basically ship it off to another QA team sitting in some other place, and they basically just run through the whole application and try every single case. So the whole point of automated tests is that you can make a computer do this for you, right? You don't need to have another team, because again, when you're talking about startups, you're talking about companies, this is a huge saving. If you can get a computer to basically do something, that's invariably the best foolproof way to do it. A computer is going to more often than not do a better job than you, because you'll do it good the first 3 times, but at the end of the day, it's a long day. You've been you've had various meetings, and you have to basically run tests again. It's not going to work the same way. You're definitely going to miss something, or you're going to convince yourself that something's working when actually it's not. So this is where automated testing comes in. And we haven't necessarily talked about this specifically, but do you guys have automated tests running in the background? So maybe something like a CI system where anytime you commit code, then you have the whole suite of tests that you've written run automatically, because it's different from writing the tests yourself. For example, Cody, you said you're a big practitioner of TDD, right? So TDD is something that you basically run each single time, the test that you run before you write the code. In addition, Do you folks basically do anything along the lines of having a CI server that runs the whole suite of tests anytime you commit code?
Yes, I've been in a lot of organizations which are all over the map. Currently at Capital One, we do have CI going, and every time we do a pull request, there's a build that's run against some subset of our automated suite, and then we have like smoke tests, which is nightly, and then we have a regression weekly. So we do have a lot of tests in our suite that are separate from the manual tests, because you can't test everything with a computer. There's definitely things like design features that are better left just for someone looking around in the app and making sure it's still pretty. Animations are another hard thing to automate. We've been dealing with a lot of that sort of stuff at our org. Because right now, like I said, I'm not only writing Android code and like leading a team of Android devs, I'm also leading the quality engineering team. So they're writing a bunch of automated scripts every sprint. We follow what's called acceptance test-driven development. So they figure out what the acceptance criteria is up front. The product people and stuff talk to QE and devs, and we're like, okay, given this, when this happens, then this happens. So we're doing that, and then we have a system, a framework in place that allows us to turn that into automated tests and like actually use the right accounts and things like that. So I would say that you can't completely replace people, and I think on the other side of the house, when it's just manual, I think that makes zero sense too. When I was at Comcast, they probably have automated stuff now, but back then it was just literally pressing buttons to make sure that the app worked as we expected. And we did have offshore teams that we would also like contract with and stuff. So it's good to get a full gamut, not only the unit tests that you write. There's a lot of different layers basically. So you do unit tests when you're writing the code. Then you do automated tests on top of that so that you have overall confidence in your application.
And for myself, I since about 2005, I've made sure that all of my unit tests were running in a continuous integration environment. Now, as each company I go to, one of the first things I like to have set up is a continuous integration server and try to get the tests running on it. It's important to note, though, too, that there are various different types of tests that need to be run, and for continuous integration environments, you're going to want a quick feedback loop for initial build. So you're going to want those unit tests that are truly unit tests to be run immediately. So these are the ones that run super fast. And the ones that are longer, maybe the UI automator, use some espresso tests and so forth, you may want to have those run on every hour, every 5 hours, or if it's a humongous suite that takes 6 hours to complete for some reason, I've seen it, you may want to have that run once a day and then have the results emailed out or so forth. But yes, I do have it. What about you, Kaushik? Do you have automated stuff?
No, we basically don't have that. It's essentially because our team is like small enough at this point. Like we just, before we like take a new feature on, or we are sort of like pushing a release, we run the whole suite of tests manually. We have always wanted to sort of like add that system in, but just haven't gotten around to it. Which is why I was curious.
Yeah, I got a podcast coming out for you that you'll like.
Oh, okay.
All right, so let's move forward a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about TDD, which is known as test-driven development, and Robolectric Katas and so forth. And I may be even butchering that word. I'm not even sure. Corey, can you explain to us what a kata is and what TDD actually is?
TDD, like we've mentioned a few times, is test-driven development. So you just write the test first. It fails. You write something to pass it, and then you can refactor if you want to. So that's the TDD process.
Cool.
But katas basically are kind of throwaway code that you do over and over again to practice these foundational things. So I first learned about this, I think it was like code retreats, it was.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So basically you go to a code retreat and you spend 6 hours, 8 hours changing up pairs and working with different people in technologies that you might not know very well, but you have, you go through, and usually it's like Conway's Game of Life, that you code from the beginning, but there's all sorts of things that you could do, and no one ever really gets to the end of it. It's really more about the process instead of the destination. And I think in coding in general, a lot of people kind of feel this preciousness with the code they've written. Like this code is amazing, it has to go to production or whatever. But it's good to practice things outside of just shipping live code. So other people don't just, necessarily do something and then ship it out to the world. People draw sketches first, and then they add colors, and then maybe they'll redo it 2 or 3 times before they get to the finalized product and actually understand what they're doing. So it really gives you a space to focus on the fundamentals and work on the different types of testing techniques that you might run into your day-to-day, so you'll get really fast at it.
Okay, cool. Now, in regard...
Don, I want to ask you a question before that.
Okay.
Sure.
Do you know where the term kata has come from?
I believe it comes from karate, but...
Yeah. So I learned karate when I was a kid, up to a certain point.
Oh, I'm not going to mess with this dude.
So in the world of karate, like there are different belts, and you guys would have probably heard of this, right? So there's like the green belt, there's like the black belt, which is like the final thing. So as you proceed to different belts, you would do this sort of like demonstration of the martial art techniques that you've learned. So that's essentially what like a kata is. So you try to, it's sort of something that you could possibly do with another group, or like usually it's done alone, where you sort of like demonstrate the techniques that you've learned from martial arts. So that's like the origin of kata. So I guess like in most like craftsmanship courses and like you said, the code retreats, they do these things called katas, where I think it's sort of like a small package where you sort of like try to demonstrate the abilities that are possible, and you sort of like run TDD on them.
Yeah.
Does that analogy make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, totally. The thing with Android katas, though, is I wasn't able to find anything at all. So I have one blog out there. I'm actually considering writing more of them. It's a blog with a GitHub repository that has like a set of tests that you would run on a sample application, and it walks you through both the what you want to do and then the solutions. So if you want to try and get started with Android katas.
I think that would be awesome if there was more of that stuff out there. I know that I personally would be taking a look at it, to wrap my head around some of the stuff that I may not understand. It'd be great.
Yeah, I did an internal workshop at Capital One, and that worked out really well. I've actually put it in at a few different conferences, so you might actually see it at a conference near you.
Cool.
Nice. So one thing, the reason we clubbed Robolectric with this whole TDD system is because, to my understanding, the only way in Android currently where you can sort of like TDD your interfaces, so like if you want to do like a developer UI in the form of a TDD practice, the only way you can do that is with Robolectric. Is that a correct summary, Corey?
It's definitely historically true. I'm not entirely sure with the new testing stuff that Android released recently. I haven't played with that yet.
Oh, sorry, actually, yeah, that's a good point. So you totally, absolutely can TDD with Espresso. Sorry.
Espresso takes a while to run,
yeah,
so that's slow. The new
exactly,
units testing stuff that Android Studio has. I haven't tried that to see if it would allow me. But basically, I think what I took away from the talk at Google I/O was you're writing your code wrong, and you need to break it up differently and stop trying to do that.
So you totally can absolutely do, like if you're using the new JUnit tests, you can definitely TDD. It's fast. The response is fast. I've done it and I do it actually. So that's good. The problem is with the unit test, you can't really drive UI interfaces unless you actually have the application run on a device versus on the JVM.
Well, it sounds like I don't want to switch then.
So that's actually a great point. You can totally TDD with Espresso, but like Corey mentioned, one of the big advantages with this whole red, green, refactor cycle, and even with TDD, is a quick response time. That is super critical to like sort of like going with the flow of TDD, because every single time you make a small change and you run your test, if it takes like even 5 or 10 seconds for you to get a response back from the change that you've made, that just like destroys the flow. It's almost impossible to do TDD at that slow a pace, which is why if you have tests that run directly on the JVM, they're way more faster. Yeah. So that's why TDD is possible. And that's also one of the reasons why Robolectric is super beneficial in TDDing, because Robolectric sort of like mocks all the actual UI. So it doesn't necessarily it doesn't run on the device, but it runs on the JVM. It sort of emulates the whole running of your application, which is why it allows you to sort of do a TDD process. So if our listeners were to go away from this episode and take basically 3 important tips on testing, what would Corey Latislaw say are the 3 big tips?
First, I would say you should practice. do something like a kata to get used to it so you can use it often and do it quickly and become comfortable. You can do that by pairing or working with other people, asking them to show you how as well. Don't be afraid to do that. Two, I would say don't let people dictate your process. If you want to write code, testing code, write the testing code. Just don't tell them you're going to do it. Just, make sure it's in your estimates and stuff. Let's see. What would be 3? You should write tests. It's good for you. Makes your refactoring pleasant without breaking anything. Because I've definitely done the thing where I've said, okay, well, I want to rework how this whole thing is written and change 4 or 5 classes and move different functions into different places, and then it doesn't work, and then I don't know why. So it's really nice to have that safety net underneath you to figure out what went wrong. And if you do TDD kind of proper, even if it's not 100% proper, but you will find after every change, you run the test again, oh, cool, it's not breaking. Okay, change something else. Doesn't break. So you don't really want to wait a long time between running your test suite. Now, I usually do one file at a time. So if I'm doing one activity or one fragment, I'll test that completely, keep running just that one class, and then I'll run the whole test suite to see that I didn't break anything anywhere else.
Yeah, that seems like a very nice flow. So, Corey, you did mention a couple of times about katas. Where's the best way so if an Android developer today listens to this episode and he says, I think Corey's extremely smart. I should do this whole kata thing that she's saying. Where's the best place to go and learn more about katas?
That would be at my website because I'm not sure if there's anything else out there that I've seen. So that's CoreyLatislaw.com. So it's CoreyLatislaw.com.
Okay, and we'll basically add links to that to the show notes. So that's a good thing.
Cool, and I'll send you the link specifically for the kata.
Excellent. Okay, Don, do you think it's time to tell our listeners about a couple of things that are awesome this week?
I love awesome stuff. Let's do it.
All right. What are your awesome picks for the week?
I just got a couple here. They're not really Android related at all. I kind of follow a whole bunch of stuff in regards to self-funded startups a lot of the times, and that's kind of what mine are around. One is a link to Heaton.com to Heaton Shaw's SaaS Weekly. And one of the episodes, episode number 19, he has something that says, stop using general click-through action text, be specific. It's pretty interesting if you're interested in testing, or you do A/B testing even on your mobile apps or your websites. He's basically saying stop using general text like sign up or buy now. Just start using stuff that makes sense, like, yes, please save me $100 right now, or something like that, because it's been proven that a lot of these highly targeted click-through actions actually perform much, much higher than generic text. So that works for mobile apps as well as websites. So that's number one. And that will be in the show notes. Another one is actually not really a link that you can just kind of get to. You need to go into your podcast app that you're using right now to hopefully listen to the show. Look for a podcast called Founder's Journey. It's by Josh Pigford. He is the founder of Baremetrics.com, I think it is. It's a SaaS analytics tool for Stripe. So you can see how your application or your company is doing if you use Stripe for payments. But he has a podcast where he talks about all the different kinds of stuff in regards to startups. And one of the ones that really resonates with me that I basically live and die by for anything that I work on and help small new startups get going with is an episode where he talks about how to blow $100,000 by saving money. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but it's basically the non-invented here syndrome. Like, well, we're engineers, we can build it, we don't need to pay for it type of thing. And you don't know what you're getting yourself into when you do that. He explains it really, really well. And this episode is literally like 8 minutes long. So just pop it in when you're on your way to work. It's a great little thing to get you in the mindset of thinking, can we pay for this, or do we actually need to build this? And that's it for me.
Fantastic. I think I'm going to add that to my Pocket Casts queue.
Yeah, I definitely need that as ammunition for people who are trying to make us write stuff from scratch.
Yes, indeed. You need to write this, huge, A/B testing framework. No, we can use one of the ones out there if it works. What about you, Kaushik?
So in a previous episode, we talked about cargo culting, which is what I called it. I think that was not the most correct term. It's cargo cult programming. So that's basically like an anti-pattern. I found this other link which talks about 9 anti-patterns that every programmer should be aware of with examples. So this is a pretty good link. So I thought it would be useful for listeners just because it sort of gives you an understanding of like some of the wrong things that the common anti-patterns that sort of develop that you should sort of be aware of and try to avoid. So that is my pick.
That one,
of the week.
that one contains I read that one, and that has the one that I think everybody's guilty of, and that's analysis paralysis.
Yeah, analysis paralysis.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interestingly, cargo cult programming is not in that, but well, we covered it in an episode. So now our listeners know 10 patterns, anti-patterns. All right. So we should wind this episode down. If people want to reach you, Corey, what's the best place that they can do that?
Sure. So I'm pretty active on Twitter. You can find me at Corey_Latislaw. And then, like I mentioned earlier, my website, CoreyLatislaw.com, is where I keep a blog and link to the books and my speaking history and stuff if you want me for a conference or whatever.
Fantastic. So you can find all the show notes for this episode at fragmentedpodcast.com/episodes/13. If you have feedback and suggestions for us, please feel free to send them at our Twitter handle, which is FragmentedCast. Now, I want to make a sort of special announcement. It's the same thing. Folks, we really do value your feedback and suggestions. So we're not just saying this as like a canned thing at the end. Really, if you have suggestions for us, please send them. We love suggestions. We love feedback. We love critique. Send them all to our Twitter handle, and Don or I, one of us, will definitely get back to you. And we absolutely read each and every single one of the tweets that comes our way. So please do send us your feedback and suggestions. Again, many people have asked how they can support the show. Right now, the best way that we have figured out that we can possibly ask your help is to go and rate the podcast on both iTunes and Stitcher. So if you have iTunes, I guess you have to set up an account. So on iTunes, search for the podcast and give us a rating there. On Stitcher as well, it would greatly help with the show being discovered more easily. If you want to get in touch with either Don or me, Don, how do people get in touch with you?
The best place to get in touch with me is through Twitter, and it's at Don Felker, and that's DONN with 2 N's, or my website at donfelker.com.
All right. And I'm Kaushik Gopal. That's my Twitter handle. And my website is kaush.co, which is kaush.co. Thank you, folks, for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.